President Putin has accepted that it was Islamic terrorists of the ISIS. He didn't say ISIS, I think he just said Islamic terrorists who conducted it. But he seemed to insinuate that there was the deep state involved in it. There was also the advisory that the Americans had put out before the attack took place, which gets all the conspiracy theorists out there to say the Americans had prior knowledge of this attack. So can you just explain about all this to us?
Well, first, let me, as a human being, just condemn the terrorism, sympathize with the victims, the families of the victims. This is a common problem across the world when we see terrorism that threatens literally every state in the world in one way or another. Whether it is a Western state, whether it's a developing state, whether it's even a Muslim state or not, we see terrorism of all sorts of stripes being one of the greatest threats that continues. And this tragedy, just as a human being, as a father, as a person, strikes me as one of the worst incidents we've seen in a long time. Secondly, certain things transcend even geopolitics, which is humanity. Whether it is warning somebody that you're in conflict with, that you have indicators of an imminent attack, which we shared with the Russians, even though obviously we're at odds on things like the Ukraine war, the unwarranted invasion of Ukraine. Other things in moments like this, as we did, transcend the politics of that day to say we condemn this, we sympathize with you. And look, we stand actually united with any country, friend or foe, against the common enemy of terrorism. That's something that I think every nation must say is unacceptable to human beings, to innocent people who are going to a concert. And you know, conspiracy theorists will always have conspiracies. We can 100% rebut those. Those are absolutely false. It's not who America is. It's not what we stand for. And the evidence is not just in the warnings, but also in the condemnation and any willingness to work to root out terrorism together anywhere.
The Russians keep saying that, you know, the ISIS doesn't target American assets. They don't do that, and it's only the non-Americans. So when ISIS attacks them, because now it seems evident that it's the ISIS attacks in that Moscow strike. So the Americans have been, the State Department has quickly come out and said, or the White House has quickly given a clean chit to the Ukrainians in this. It seemed like too sudden to give a clean chit and say there was no Ukrainian involvement in this attack.
Stupid fires need to be put out immediately. And with all due respect, that's a stupid fire. Couldn't be further from the truth. And we not only indicate there's no evidence, but as that gathers, the more you even restate the false accusation, the more oxygen that fire gets. And it's also a false statement that we have not been the target of ISIS. We've been the target of ISIS for years, for decades now, unfortunately. Since the beginning of ISIS, we've actively fought war against them and their terrorist ways, the ways they've enslaved women, the ways they've gone after religious minorities, their extremist brand of politics and of their fundamental beliefs. That couldn't be further from the truth. This is a common enemy. If folks want to take a tragedy like this and make it even more tragic with lies, that's their decision. But we stand in solidarity with the victims, and we stand in solidarity with any victims of terrorism.
Let's get on to India-US relations. As ambassador, let's talk about the areas of dissonance before we talk about areas of convergence. Why is the state administration, why is the American administration protecting Panu?
Well, let's start actually with convergence, because I know maybe the bad news sells, but I think anybody listening should know that this is the deepest, strongest relationship that we've ever had in the history of our two nations. And it's so exciting to be ambassador at this moment, when not only can we talk about great things together and move forward, but when there's ever areas of dissonance or disagreement, we actually manage those incredibly well. It's like a healthy marriage. You know, you don't agree all the time on everything with the person you love, but there is deep love, deep affinity, deep, real friendship that I think is not just government to government, but people to people. And I would reframe how you said it. We take seriously any threats or any criminal activities that are referred to us in our own country from India or concerns that India has about its own national security. Every single time. There isn't a single time where we say, nope, sorry, won't look at that. We take very seriously looking at it, but we also have had wonderful engagements, even in the last couple of weeks, of understanding each other's systems, which unfortunately, they're two vibrant democracies, the two biggest democracies in the world, but aren't exactly the same. Things have to always line up here to a level of evidence that would work in the Indian courts, same things in the United States. And we have a very robust freedom of speech that exists that's different than the freedom of speech that exists here. In order to get a criminal conviction in the United States of America, you have to actually be taking action, not just making speech. But we take very seriously the threat against Indian diplomats. We take very seriously the criminal activities of transnational criminal enterprises that may, one, have drug dealing, or two, arms running, or three, human trafficking. We're seeing a lot of that on our southern border, actually originating from India, where now Indians are the third largest group of unlawful entrants to the United States. So I would reframe it, because I don't think that's the right framing to say that anybody's protected. Nobody is protected from our laws, period. Doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter what you do. If you break the law, you will be held accountable in the United States. If the question is, why isn't somebody sent to India just because India asked for them, that's the training we're doing together with both of our law enforcements. And that would work for somebody coming from India to the U.S. to understand those systems and to make sure it's successful in a court of law.
You said you spoke about freedom of speech. Gurpatwant Singh Panu it's not just speech. He just last week, he spoke about election interference and said there was active election interference where funds were released to one of the political parties in India. I'm agnostic about which political party and whether it's the BJP, the Aam Aadmi Party, doesn't matter. The fact is that he has actively said that funds were transferred to one political party. That's election interference. Threat to the Prime Minister. Open threat to the Prime Minister. Open threat to air safety, where he threatens that Air India will be bombed. These are violent threats.
I very much respect what you're saying. Tend to agree when people do step over the line saying something will be bombed, as opposed to saying somebody shouldn't fly. The United States freedom of speech, we want success for anybody. If there's a criminal accusation, to actually reach the threshold that would have a successful outcome. And I'm not speaking about the specific case, in anything. And we are helping our Indian counterparts understand that people can express opinions like, oh, I think this is going to happen. American citizens, by the way. And under our law, for an American citizen to be convicted in an American court or to be deported to have a criminal case in another country, it has to meet our law. And so we'll continue working, and if anybody ever says something that steps over that line, and I know it's gotten very close, we will be working together on that.
So basically, right now, the investigation against Gurpatwant Singh Pannu is Americans convincing or trying to convince Indian authorities that he is within the law in doing what he's doing.
No. Each incident is looked at each time. And if the Indian government ever brings up something, if they gave up something today, we'd be looking at it tomorrow. It's not an ongoing investigation of a person. That's not how our criminal justice system works. It's, we believe there's an act. If a friend from another country is saying this is an act that transcends a border, we will always look at that, take that incredibly seriously. I can't tell you how many resources have gone towards that. And not just that, by the way. When there have been attacks, for instance, against the consulate in San Francisco, there have been thousands of hours, tremendous resources, millions of dollars put into that investigation. I hope that will have a positive resolution. Nobody should be able to break the law. That's a clear action, trying to set something on fire. Cases can be difficult because you have to put the evidence together, but I hope that something like that is a better example of when something clearly transcends into action and not just words.
So action has been taken against those who attacked the Indian mission?
I can't comment on an ongoing investigation.
Okay.
I can say we've worked incredibly closely together on that investigation.
Right. Ambassador, I want to come to the plot to assassinate Panu. During a congressional hearing, and I'm quoting, the Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, Donald Lu, told members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I quote, we are at the moment working with India to encourage India to hold accountable those responsible for this terrible crime. What we can see is that India itself has announced that they have created a committee of inquiry to look into this matter, and we ask them to work quickly and transparently to make sure justice is done. Could you tell me a little bit about where the investigation is and where India and the US are on this?
Right. So a couple of things. One, this is another piece of evidence of how strong and close our relationship really is. I mean, it's almost unthinkable a few years ago that we would be coordinating together to hold accountable on both sides of our borders criminal action, whether it was the attack in San Francisco or was something like this that has been alleged. I'm not the criminal justice investigator of this, so I can't comment on what our, nor would we comment publicly on what our criminal investigation is uncovering, and that's something that's separate from our diplomatic track. We keep that. That's a police, that's a FBI, that's a federal law enforcement, and ultimately U.S. Attorney's Office investigation held very tightly. But I will say that I was very pleased that India put together this commission of inquiry, put senior people who are experienced in law enforcement on that, and that they have been digging in on this side domestically to uncover any evidence that would show a murder for hire plot that included anybody who was from the Indian government. I think that's absolutely critical. For any of us, just abstractly, that has to be a red line. No government or government employee can be involved in the alleged assassination of one of your own citizens. That's just an unacceptable red line. And I think that shows the seriousness
One of your own
with which
citizens is one of
the alleged plot is against an American citizen. So,
so your citizen.
Exactly, the U.S. citizen. And I say that in an abstract way. The same thing would happen if there was an American plot against some sort of, or an American government person who was trying to assassinate somebody in another country or was a part of that. That would be an unacceptable red line for any nation.
That would be an American living in India.
Hypothetically, I'm not speaking of...
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to...
Before the conspiracy theorists say there's something out there, I'd say any country, any country, having an active member of their government involved in a second country trying to assassinate one of their citizens. That's, I think, usually a red line for any country. That's a basic issue of sovereignty. That's a basic issue of rights. And I'm very pleased. Again, this is, to use the metaphor before, if we have this incredible friendship, even marriage right now, this was maybe one of the first big conflicts. And we're actually not only coming through it, I think, strongly, but so far, everything that's been asked of the Indian government has been done, and I would say vice versa. Whenever there is accusations the other direction, we take that incredibly seriously.
You spoke about the major conflict. I think ever since you have come to India, this is probably the biggest conflict situation that you've dealt with, isn't it? The Panu case.
And I always say, look, the test of a friendship, the test of a relationship is not the easy times, but the difficult ones. And I think not only are we passing new tests, going over the largest hurdles we ever have in terms of opportunities, but challenges were actually, whether they're global challenges together, differences of opinions in the multilateral space, global events, or things that are bilateral like this, India and the U.S. are showing their resilience and that we really want this relationship for the long haul. So as we learn each other's systems, as we have momentary conflicts, if we can get through these, I think it's a great thing for the world.
Is this hurdle going to hamper India-US relations in any manner?
I don't believe so. In fact, I've said the pace of work for every conspiracy theorist who said, oh, it was going so well, and then at the end of the year, this is a hiccup. So we haven't slowed down one bit. In fact, we've accelerated our work on education. We've accelerated our work on technology. We've accelerated our work on military relations. We've accelerated our work on trade. These things are even going faster than ever. So while this is an incredibly important principle for us, it's an incredibly important issue for us. So far, like I said, we've been satisfied with the coordination on this particular issue, and it hasn't slowed a single thing down.
You know, I get when you talk about military cooperation, people-to-people cooperation, everything that trade issues and Indian students going, several issues where we are cooperating. But then the Khalistan issue is something which is so emotive. And it seems to us Indians that the Americans are tone deaf to understand that we have gone through hell in the 1980s. And if on Khalistan we cannot come on the same page, it's extremely hard. If you remember, I don't know if you can recall going back right to the 80s when Rajiv Gandhi as Prime Minister had gone to DC, and there he was accosted by a separatist, a Khalistani. And at that time, Rajiv Gandhi as Prime Minister, and I'm talking about 35 years ago, where he turned around and he said that if there is a Khalistan, it's in your country. It's not here. So since then, India has been through fire on the Khalistan issue, and it seems like we are back to the same page where we just don't trust the Americans on the Khalistan issue. Why are Americans tone deaf to that?
Well, I would, again, reframe it. I don't think that we are at all. Many of us know that history, have dear, close friends who had members of their family killed, who witnessed barbarity in the streets of this city right here in response, an assassination of a prime minister, people being killed because of their religion and their heads on sticks. We know that history. And I talked to an Indian friend who said, look, don't try to be rational with us and don't try to be caring with us. It's this, and he pointed to the backside of his brain. He's like, it's this piece, the traumatized brain, that whenever you talk to an Indian about this issue that is speaking. Conversely, I think in the United States, the strength of that feeling isn't enough to break the law that we have. And it's very important for us to not only be sensitive and to work more closely than ever. Anybody out there who says we're tone deaf, we've never worked more closely with Indian law enforcement on people who happen to be part of criminal networks who are working in my state, in California, for instance. We've taken down, arrested. We're working on deportations together, on extraditions rather, together now. We're coordinating cases in a way that we never did. If there wasn't trust there, how could we do that? It's deep trust. Talk to somebody inside, one of the criminal investigative units here in India working with their counterparts in the United States. They know each other's names. They talk daily. These are a level of coordination that's never existed. So we can restate that narrative over and over. It doesn't make it the truth. I know that. I have deep sensitivities to that. And we're not just saying, hey, we are never going to look at these things. We look at every single accusation, but the strength of emotion also doesn't make it inherently violate our laws. So one of the things I always state to my American friends is, it's true sometimes in the diaspora these movements are so much stronger than here, where there is a quite unified country. India, like ours, is a complex, diverse democracy. That's a tough thing to manage. And I've been so impressed with what I've seen on the ground here in managing that. But I don't think we should keep restating something that isn't true, because the level of the coordination, of cooperation, and understanding of history does exist there. If we say it over and over, people will believe it, but that's not my day-to-day experience at all.
It is true to state it over and over again, is because you've been mayor of Los Angeles. You know what, in the West Coast, there are Khalistan parades which are held. Yuba City has Khalistan parades. They have an Indian Prime Minister's assassination on a tableau. They have all this. And Khalistan is now an American problem. It's not an Indian problem. So just like Taliban wasn't just an Afghanistan problem, it became, and Al-Qaeda was not just an Afghanistan problem, it became America's problem. And today there is no Khalistan in India. There's no Khalistan movement in India. It's in Yuba City. It's in Vancouver. It's in Surrey. It's in North America.
It's two different systems. Look, in the United States, we have people who march and say things that are abhorrent to us. I live in a country where I listen to people who say abhorrent things all the time. When I was president of our city council, people had protected hate speech. They could say horrible things about your ethnicity. We have people who talk about not wanting to be a part of America. Our system protects that speech, for better or for worse. It's never nice. We have a philosophy, I think, that comes from you fight speech with more speech. And that can be foreign, I know, to the Indian ear sometimes. That can be a strange system. They can say, why don't you just arrest people for what they say? We don't have that system. I, as ambassador, can't change that rule. I don't know if I'd want to. Even while it hurts us sometimes, things that are just about America, not even talking about India at all, what people say. As a Jew, I had people who stood on, a freeway overpass in my city condemning Jews. Yeah. And they're not arrested. If they threaten violence, they can be. But it's also a slippery slope. Once you start doing arresting for what people say, that can go really extreme. And so it's the American philosophy not to. But again, I'd keep coming back to this. A, to give a caricature of all Americans of Indian descent, that they are secessionists, is not true. And I think it's unfair to Sikh Americans. It's unfair to Indian Americans. This caricature that sometimes comes out of here that America is just this hotbed of people who hate India, that's not true at all either. Okay. I mean, I know my fellow Angelenos, Californians, and Americans who are part of this amazing bridge between our two countries, who have done that for years. The first member of Congress who was Asian American was actually Indian American, and he was Sikh. And he was from Southern California in the 1950s when Indians, immigrants, faced all sorts of discrimination. And that's an amazing part of our civil rights history. So again, it's really easy to paint a white or a black. It's not in America at all. And while there may be some frustrating parts of our system, and vice versa, that doesn't mean that needs to stand in the way of our progress, the friendship, and the depth of this relationship, which is unprecedented.
You spoke about the Indian diaspora, so let me come to that. On the green card backlog issue, 3% of those who submitted their applications are expected to get their GC this year. the backlog is 34.7 million, and that's mostly Indians who are on the
Yeah.
backlog. Can you give me a little clarity on what is the wait list like and when is it going to happen? I believe in some cases it's more than a century's wait.
Right, it is. No, part of this is a legislative problem that Congress will have to address on whether it's the number of legal immigrants, the number of green cards, or the number of people who can become citizens. There's just limits on that. Like any country, I'm sure there's limits here too. And that is frustrating for Indians, I think, because there's so many Indians who want to come to America. And that's a great part of our news, by the way. Second only to Mexicans, were Indian visas last year. The biggest number of students, double the second biggest. Last year, over 245,000 student visas came from India. Number one in adoptions, number one in all these categories that show, 1.4 billion people, a lot of them would love to come to America. And so it's a good problem to have. But a couple of things we're changing. One is helping people with H-1Bs not have to go out of the country to get those renewed. That's going to happen, I hope, with their families soon. We've here in not just Delhi, but across India, increased 60% in a single year with the same number of people, the number of visas that we adjudicated, and brought down wait times by 75%. So again, that would be more a question for Congress to resolve. I certainly would love to see the ability for us to welcome more Indian immigrants legally, welcome more to become green card holders, and also in strategic sectors where we need that sort of workforce. And we've seen how beneficial that has been in our healthcare, in our tech, and other places. So while other countries, I think sometimes their immigrants say, why are you helping Indians so much? We're helping those who help themselves, and we're seeing the positive outcomes.
Does that
the
happen?
Indian-American
Do people
bridge.
come and ask you that? Why Indians?
Oh, of course. Indians complain about Indians, as they should, and
Yeah.
we actually are very responsive. It's a huge priority for me, for the president. But the rest of the countries are like, wait a second, that isn't even proportionate to the large population of Indians when they have a quarter of the student visas, when they have, the largest group of H-1Bs by far. So India is doing quite well in our system. And our system, I think, is looking at how it can continue to improve and maybe even expand the numbers. But that will require Democrats, Republicans, and independents to come together.
To come together. 2 points that you mentioned. One is the 75% time,
Decrease.
on the visa appointment, and the other one is the 245,000 students, applicants. So let me get to the visa appointment first. 250 days wait, despite the 75% time limit reduced. So how will you streamline this?
Yeah.
Whether 250 is still a long wait.
It is, and too high for me. The president said, Eric, I want you to bring down visa wait times in India. I think it's probably the first time a president ever said that to an ambassador in any country. I don't think presidents even focus on visa wait times, but we all have so many Indian friends who are saying, why is this taking so long, that it even went up to the president. So the reality of that 250 is an average, and I think the typical person is actually under 200 days already. It's difficult with the existing resources. So two different things we're doing. One is we've talked about opening 2 new consulates in the near future, one in Bangalore, another one that will be in Ahmedabad. 2, we're working with the Ministry of External Affairs to put more bodies in India, and they've been very responsive and helpful. For instance, we opened up in Hyderabad, the newest, most expensive, most beautiful consulate anywhere in the world for the U.S., but it was only, the counters were only 1/3 filled because we didn't have enough people approved by the Indian government to come work here. And then we have to, of course, hire them. And last year, as part of the state visit, there was an agreement on that. MEA did a wonderful job, allowed us to hire more. And so you'll see a couple dozen more people come on board this year. Third, we're shipping it out. We have people doing remote adjudications in Washington, in China, where the number of people getting visas has gone way down, and other places around the world. So if there's a consular officer who doesn't have enough work in another country, they're working on Indian visas too. So people around the world, more bodies, looking at future consulates, and then just improving our systems and seeing what ways we can do. But remember, there's 5 million Indians that today already have visas that are good for about a decade to come as tourists. This is only for tourist first-time visits. The rest, there's no wait time in all the other categories for the first time in years.
Sounds good. Let's get to the student visas and the students who are going. Ambassador, 245,000 students that you spoke about, but of late there is there are these Indian students, the attack on Indian students. So can you just, there are a number of Indian parents who are watching this podcast, students who are watching, who are going to be applying, and especially some of them who have already got acceptance from American campuses. There was also a video podcast by Indra Nui who explained as to what Indian students should watch out for when they go for studying to the US, which campuses, and how to be safe and secure. So could you tell me about the safety of Indian students?
Of course. Well, first and foremost, to any families, and I've talked to some of those families who have faced a tragedy with their own son or daughter. I mean, our hearts go out. We take the justice issues very seriously, of bringing to justice any perpetrators. With, 250,000 now a year, statistically, this is going to happen. But that's not acceptable to a parent if it happens to your child.
Sure.
So there are things we can do just to be aware, to have a heads up, to know which neighborhoods you should and shouldn't go into that are higher crime areas. The same sort of advice we give travelers when they go around the world, including to places like India. We know that these things can happen, but you can play a role in lessening the risk. Go with friends. Make sure that you always have a person who's keeping an eye on you and that you can check in on. And look, these are very different cases. Sometimes it might be somebody with mental health issues, and it could be a suicide. Other times it's an attack. We don't know if it's a hate crime or if it's just a random attack because somebody was robbing somebody. But crime happens. Tragedies happen, and the best way you can prevent is by knowing your city, talking to your campus safety people about the safest ways to get on transportation, the safest places to be, and ensuring that you know that there are certain reckless behaviors that you should engage in. That obviously illegal drug use is not something you should be trying in the United States of America. That can be a pathway towards all sorts of bad things. So it was a series of those suggestions, and we're looking at how we can better package those together with the Indian government, just to let new students know, come to America. Statistically, it's going to be an extremely safe, very enjoyable thing. But to ensure that you aren't enmeshed in any tragedy, here are things you can do to protect yourself.
Yes, because at least for my generation, parents used to think that, sending your kids to America, kids can take public transport. Cases of muggings don't happen unless you're going into the inner city area or something. At least near college campuses, this didn't happen. But now increasing reports, of course, statistically, as you said. So the law and order situation in many of these college cities, it is a source of worry for parents who are sending kids. I know of many parents who say, I'm making the option of sending them to Australia or sending them to even New Zealand, but not America, not Canada. I'm worried about the hate crimes in these cities in North America. So, of course, it's not fair to ask you to speak about the situation in Canada, but generally, would you say that there's cause for worry or there isn't?
No, I think there's always just safe things to do, but there's not. I mean, crime has gone down, violent crime, especially in the last few years. It's much safer than it was in the 1970s and 1980s, when I think part of it is just that we can find these cases very quickly. We now have media, social media, that really lessens the space between distant places. We might not have heard of it back then, but it is a safe place to come. We encourage Indian students to come. We love our Indian students. And there's also things that whether you're in America, whether you're in Canada, whether you're in Australia, whether you're in New Zealand, whether you're here in India, that you should do to make sure you're safe.
Let me come to your story.
Sure.
Right? I saw your interview with Jimmy Kimmel. That was a couple of years ago. There was also this situation where people talked about you being, running for president, and then 2 years for you to get approved to come here as ambassador. So tell me that story.
Well, American politics is, as any observer will show, going through a very dynamic period. But I really think that leadership, my philosophy has always been that leadership for nations comes from local communities, which is why I spent 21 years in local government. It's where you see people's faces. It's where you learn their names, you meet their families, you improve their street, their community, and I loved that. And I feel sometimes that in our country, Washington, D.C. had become disconnected from that, that listening to America's communities. I started an organization called Accelerator for America that was really about listening to solutions for America's problems through our local communities and understanding our deepest challenges, whether it was economic development, jobs, women's empowerment, from the perspective of everyday Americans, not just the most empowered. Ultimately, I decided not to run for president because I didn't think I could do a good job finishing what I told voters I would do, which is to be their mayor and
Voters
run
in Los
in
Angeles,
Los
just in
Angeles.
case our
So
listeners.
for 9.5 years, I was very, very honored to be the mayor of Los Angeles, our second biggest city, kind of more like the chief minister title here than what we call mayors here, which mayors in India are more like the city council president, which was my job before that. But, then going through confirmation, I was very proud. I got a bipartisan, strong vote in the end, Republicans and Democrats, even as somebody who was a Democrat. A lot of people vote against you just because of your party affiliation. And we have some people who really restored my faith in democracy saying, look, I don't care if you're a Democrat. I know who you are. I know you've had a long history with India, a professor of international relations, a military officer, that you've done the sorts of things that make you eminently qualified. And they, quote unquote, crossed over the line, which is done less and less in America these days. I think any democracy can fight out its differences, but also has to find its common values. And so luckily, the confirmation, for me, the good news of the delay was I got to serve out my very last day as mayor. I never felt like I left the voters of LA even one day early. Had a couple-month break, and then I was here.
Was it a consolation prize coming to India?
Not at all. No, this is the most sought out. If you look at the people who have been here, from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who went on to be one of our most famous politicians, great senators, UN ambassador, from John Kenneth Galbraith, who was probably one of the greatest economists who's ever lived and a close friend of the Kennedys. I think what the president told me, because he asked me to join the cabinet, but I couldn't leave my city in the midst of the Omicron crisis. People were dying in my city, and I said, that's the last thing I would do, Mr. President. If you really want me, you can, keep pushing, but I would prefer to stay here. And it was a few months later, he said, I really need you to consider a huge job. And that tradition of somebody close to the president, I was his campaign co-chair. I helped lead the vice presidential search and chaired his inauguration. He said, I need one of my very closest people. He said, I'd love to have you by my side here at the White House, but consider this. And when he said the word India, he had me at hello, because since I came here when I was 14 years old, this country has captured my heart. And in some way, I think it was a combination, 50% Joe Biden, 50% India, that pulled me back to a place I always dreamed of living in.
What did you do when you came in when you were 14? How come?
My parents brought me here with my sister. It was just a trip. They wanted us to see the world and to understand the world. They had a very diverse background. My father is Mexican-American. My mother's Jewish-American. They grew up on opposite sides of the track, but they met, and they were both working for Pan Am Airlines. And so if they had an extra dollar in their bank account, they didn't put it into a nicer home or a bigger car. They took us on a trip.
Pan Am ticket?
Well, yeah. Well, until Pan Am went bankrupt.
Can you imagine? Youngsters today won't even know. They'll have to Google to see what is Pan Am.
Check it out. It's a great logo, too.
Yeah.
And so I think it was on a Pan Am flight. We came here when I was 14, spent 2 weeks here.
Where?
We went everywhere. We went to Mumbai. We went to Ajanta and Ellora. We went to Varanasi. We went to Jaipur. We went to Udaipur. We went to, of course, to Delhi. I mean, we saw a lot of places. And then the most incredible thing, and he is here today as we speak. I went
Your
to
dad?
university. No, my parents were here. But my college roommate, Jared Clark, who was randomly assigned to me. You get a roommate to share a room with two beds in one room. He, my second year of university, I started taking Hindi and Urdu because of having been here when I was 14. He said, guess what? My dad, who's in the Foreign Service, just became the U.S. ambassador to India. Do you want to come visit?
Oh.
And everybody gets chills when I tell them the story. I do still. I said, of course. And I came here the second time, stayed at Roosevelt House, which is the ambassador's residence here in the embassy. And I never would have dreamed that, some decades later, I would come back as the ambassador. And Jared is visiting with his wife here. We actually went to Roosevelt House yesterday for him to take a tour of this place he lived in. And, I was sold on India from the very beginning.
For our viewers who'd get a little confused over why you would visit Roosevelt House, maybe you'd like to tell us about the renovation and things that's going on.
So part of our growing relationship with India is that we're bursting at the seams. So not only the new consulate at Hyderabad, the two new consulates hopefully that will open up in Ahmedabad and Bengaluru, we're building a new embassy. We're going to keep the existing one as an important historic building, but we'll be breaking ground. We've already started breaking ground. So the ambassador's residence that I would live in is totally sealed up so that it doesn't get harmed by the construction, and maybe the next ambassador or 2 ambassadors from now will live back in Roosevelt House. So I'm in temporary quarters until then.
You spoke about Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, friend of India, and you spoke about President Biden asking you to come to India. While you say, and we've seen that too, those of us who have done the beat journalism, we know that it took 2 years of very excruciatingly painful bureaucratic tussle
Yes.
to get a US ambassador to India. But Indians at that time were like, maybe we don't figure in the American scheme of things, because for 2 years, if America doesn't appoint anybody to India, and now India doesn't have an ambassador in DC, does that mean that the post of the post of ambassador really doesn't matter between these two countries?
Well, I'll say this. With no ambassador, you still have tens of thousands of people working on this relationship all the time. At the university level, at the department or ministry level, our national security advisors, our president and prime minister. No one person is this relationship dependent on. But I will say having an ambassador exponentially accelerates that work. And I think it was quite the contrary. It wasn't that the U.S. didn't care about India. It's that our president said, we want to send somebody very senior, very close to me, the president, that people will know has the ear of the president directly, as we had in the past. And we're going to stick to that until we get that. And in the meantime, by the way, it wasn't that we didn't have a chief of mission. We had incredible former ambassadors who came here to fill in that time, really seasoned hands who were great. But I hope, and I have to thank India and the Indian people who have embraced me so warmly. I mean, everywhere I go around India, people are like, oh, you're the ambassador. They want to come I probably take 1,000 pictures a week, with Indians, meet their children, eat their food, like go into their homes. It's been an amazing experience. And I think that the president was wise in saying, we will push this, get through it, because we want somebody who can help elevate this relationship. And the timing was perfect. I came in, we had the state visit from the prime minister, who by all accounts was his most successful foreign trip ever. And vice versa, we had the president come here for an incredibly successful G20, which India deserves so much credit. The most successful G20, I think, in history, and certainly the most wide-ranging. To me, that sealed the deal. Somebody told me he was an ambassador. If you get one visit from your president in 4 years or something when you're ambassador, or your head of government in the country you're in visits Washington once, you're lucky. I had both in the first 4 months. And that wasn't just them. We had our cabinet and your cabinet all the time engaging with each other. That's extraordinary. Number 1 country for military exercises right now. In fact, we have one underway as we speak.
Oh dear. Yeah. Now you're going to the military exercises. I was just about to go on the leadership
No, go ahead,
thing.
please.
Let's go to the military exercises,
all right.
now that you've talked about military exercises. When we speak about areas of convergence, defense sector is very important. 2 things that I want to ask you about: the Predator drones and the jet engines. Where are the negotiations stuck right now?
They're not stuck at all. So the Predator drones moved forward. Now we're awaiting India's last signature, essentially, but it went through the congressional notification. It was accelerated. It went ahead of some other things. It jumped the queue, showing the priority and how important we saw this deal. And even in the quote-unquote, some people were predicting rockier times because of what we talked about earlier, it actually went through and shows the strength of this relationship. So those are in a great place. And then the engines also, that will take years for engines to be made because they're very complicated, most exquisite technology we've ever shared with anybody, including some of our closest allies that we have not shared this kind of technology with. But both are 100% on track. We're satisfied. Indians are satisfied. My job is, and I think my Indian counterparts would say the same, is to help GE and HAL, which is the local manufacturer here, domestic manufacturer, try to get their ecosystems accelerated so that we can see those in Indian planes sooner than later.
So this the transfer of strategic technology. We are not a NATO ally. We are a strategic partner. Does the transfer of technology happen smoothly, or will there be roadblocks?
No, it happens very smoothly. You're actually a preferred defense partner, which is a very high level, very unique, and something that happened a couple years ago between U.S. and India. And I hope it's the beginning of many things. We're looking at armored cars and howitzers together. We need to develop also weapons that can confront the new nature of war. We're seeing this, in the Red Sea right now, that cheap drones and other cheaply made missiles can only be brought down today by $1 million missile in defense. The nature of warfare is changing, and I think that U.S. and India are looking for solutions together, which is why in this X we started matching startups in the defense sector of the U.S. and India together to co-develop and maybe someday co-produce some of the answers to these challenges.
Before my next question, here's a short primer on the Citizenship Amendment Act and the fracas that ensued after the US State Department made a comment on it. At a media conclave in New Delhi, Ambassador Garcetti commented on an Indian legislation and said, and I quote, "Religious freedom is a cornerstone of democracy. The US can't give up on that principle." He further said, "You can't give up on principles no matter how close you are with friends or, if it comes to that, your worst enemy, when those are principles that you stand for." The bill that was being discussed was the Citizenship Amendment Act. The Indian government had notified the rules for implementation of the CAA, which was passed by the parliament over 4 years ago. The rules allow for minorities persecuted on religious grounds in Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan to acquire citizenship in India, but it does not accord this privilege to Muslim minority groups in the essentially Islamic nations. The Ministry of External Affairs MEA spokesperson Randhir Jaiswal reacted sharply to the US State Department spokesperson who had commented on the CAA. He called it, and I quote, "misplaced, misinformed and unwarranted." He said about the CAA that it's an internal matter of India and is in keeping with India's inclusive traditions and our long-standing commitment to human rights. He also said, India's constitution guarantees freedom of religion to all its citizens. There are no grounds for any concern on treatment of minorities. Vote bank politics should not determine views about a laudable initiative to help those in distress, said the MEA spokesperson. He also said sharply that lectures by those who have limited understanding of India's pluralistic traditions and the region's post-partition history are best not attempted. And then he said partners and well-wishers of India should welcome the intent with which this step has been taken. These sentiments were also echoed by the Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. One question is that what happened with you at a recent conclave, you spoke about Human Rights and Citizens Amendment Bill. That became a little bit of a knotty affair. Then the State Department spokesperson said something about it. And that became complicated because the Indian External Affairs Ministry spokesperson, he said that partners, and I quote, "partners and well-wishers of India should welcome the intent which this step has been taken." Do you see this as a problem area now with an American ambassador commenting on India's internal affairs?
No, it was the State Department that spoke first, and I just reiterated the State Department's position. So I wasn't making news, and we should get the sequence correctly.
Okay.
It's something that we monitor, and I said that. And I said in broad strokes that religious freedom is an important part of any democracy. Protecting minorities is very important. That doesn't have to be read negatively.
Yes. Political sledging happens, as elections come closer. So any statement would take wind of its own. I mean, like if an Indian ambassador was to say, comment on the judicial system of America, that would be seen as interference.
And I think it's the job of monitoring what happens. That's the job of an ambassador. That's the job of a State Department, Ministry of External Affairs job, and Indian ambassador's job is to monitor and to report. And we simply said that. If people want to read new words besides that into it, they can, but that doesn't mean...
So there's this, degrees of separation, because then everybody connects it that America gets its cues from the Five Eyes instead of the intel cooperation that happens between India and the US.
Let me just dispel, when I was a city council member, once there was a person speaking, we have the ability to petition directly, so we have citizen comments every meeting. And one of them said, "This is a conspiracy, you guys are going to vote this way, we know this is cooked and nobody's listening to what we're saying." And this veteran politician turned to me and said, Eric, the problem with conspiracy theories is no one's smart enough to pull them off. I say 99.9% of people's conspiracy theories is not the way the world actually works. We have a deep friendship. It's very respectful. Sometimes we can agree to disagree on things and continue with our business, and we shouldn't take it with thin skin. We shouldn't take it personally. Certainly, I open up the United States, I say all the time, from a place of humility. We have a ton of flaws. We're open to criticisms. We want to listen. But I think the most important thing for all of us is to find common international law that we can all be a part of, try to implement equally, and respect the specific histories that every country has. And the more that you know about that, the better positioned you are when you are monitoring things to be able to comment.
Finally, I'd like to ask you about the chemistry between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi. Both are going in for re-election. Your president has said, and I quote, that the partnership with India is the most consequential in the world. Is it hyperbole or is it really true?
He has said that privately. He told that to me. He said, Eric, this is the most important country in the world to me, when he was asking me to become ambassador. Now, I love Joe Biden. We're dear, deep friends for many, many years. I figured, it's just Joe Biden. He says this to every ambassador, that France is the most important country, Mexico is the most important country. But he wasn't lying. He meant it, because I heard him say it, that directly in the Oval Office to the Prime Minister, that this is the most consequential relationship. And if your listeners take one thing away from this, it's so easy to get caught up in what the psychologist Sigmund Freud once called the narcissism of small differences, right? We did a lot of that in this podcast. Well, isn't it this? Or this freedom of speech is this way, and isn't there a conspiracy about that? The reality is, Indians, look at it in polls, love Americans.
Yeah.
The reality is, Americans love Indians. The bridge has never been stronger. The work that we're doing has never been more important. And it's consequential not just for India and for the United States. It's consequential for the world. The big fight isn't between each other and these small differences we sometimes have. The big fight is between extremist ideology, dictatorship. We have two democracies that, yes, we have to fight to defend domestically all the time, and hopefully internationally the concept of democracy. But is there any country that you'd rather be in than India? For me, as an American, is there any other relationship you'd rather be engaged in? I would certainly not. This is the most exciting place to be in the world right now, the intersection of the United States and America. And I love Indians, I love India, and it's been the honor of my life to be here.
You've been traveling a lot in India. What part of India really fascinated you, and you had to rethink about if you had any personal views about that part of India earlier?
I don't know if it was that I have personal views, because I've traveled a lot in my life here, but I've been to 22 states now and Union territories.
Yeah. Is that a record now for an Indian American ambassador?
I mean, a couple of them went to all of them, but in 11 months it may be a record, because in the shortness of time. But a couple places, I mean, when I was up in Himachal Pradesh, Arunachal Pradesh, from one side of the Himalayas to the other, just the breathtaking beauty. Nagaland, the incredible culture that was in that state during the Hornbill Festival. Kanyakumari in the south. I loved being in the water, probably as one of the only non-Indians greeting the sunlight in front of the Vivekananda statue and feeling the intersection of three bodies of water and the greeting of a new day. It's breathtaking to me. The more you know about India, the more you know you don't know. It's almost an unquenchable thirst. And for me, I'm going to get to all 36 states and union territories. And I hope the most important thing, because you have a little bit of a bubble as ambassador, is I can get to some rural life, some villages, and really talk to everyday Indians about their dreams and what we can do to help those dreams in the future.
I cannot conclude without asking you about cricket. India-Pakistan cricket match happening the first time in the United States.
Yes.
Are you going to attend it? Have you done any kind of cricket playing or cricket watching?
I've gone from a hardcore baseball player to a huge cricket fan. Probably the biggest accomplishment, many Indian friends said, that I did was a combination of my last job and this one, is I got to announce here that we're putting cricket into the Los Angeles Olympics, and it'll become an Olympic sport for the first time in 2028. And I announced that in Mumbai a few months back. I play with our embassy team. I've gone to a lot of IPL matches. I went to some World Cup ones too. I love cricket, and I can explain it in a minute to any Americans who say, I don't understand the game. So I'm like a cricket ambassador.
Seriously?
And I hope to get to the game in New York. But I'm really excited. We have a Major League Cricket League now in the United States. And long after I'm ambassador, you can count on me to be in the stands in Los Angeles, hopefully when we finally build a pitch around the Olympics, watching a good cricket game with my Indian friends.
And I saw the video which you had about eating gujia since we are in the holy season.
Yes.
So Indian food, you're taking to it?
I didn't have to take to it. It's always been a part of my life. I've cooked Indian
LA.
food.
Yeah.
I've loved Indian food, but I love going to each of the bhawans here in Delhi and sampling all the states. And the way to my heart is through my stomach, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's the spices, they don't bother you?
No, I love the spices. I'm half Mexican, so this thing where, let me announce this to all of our Indian friends. When you see Americans, you say, we've toned down the spices. a lot of Americans, depending on their backgrounds, and by the way, you don't have to be Mexican American, love spicy. In fact, I want to do a contest and maybe have the Mexican ambassador, Peruvian ambassador, Thai ambassador, Korean ambassador, and somebody representing India and myself who can take the spiciest food.
The chili.
Maybe A and I can do that.
Yeah,
can sponsor it.
That would be really interesting. Have you tried that? In fact, there is a Clinton thali in one of the restaurants
right.
because the Clintons love Indian food, and that really set the pattern because every subsequent president had to go through the thali test.
Yes, of course. The thali test is an important one. I mean, if you don't know, like I wake up most mornings with chole bhaturi, like is my first, taste of the day. If you can't pass your Indian like mitai test, and if you don't know your specifics, you're not going to do well. But if you do, Indians really connect with you. I think cricket and food are the ways to connect.
Yes.
I think when I visited Shah Rukh Khan my first couple weeks
Yes.
here, and we talked cricket because, of course, he's involved as a cricket owner. He owns part of the Los Angeles team. Everybody in my office went nuts. They're like, "Oh my God, did you know who you met?" I said, "Yeah, Shah Rukh Khan," but I didn't realize the level of love that there was across the country.
Yes.
And it's an amazing thing
He's
to see
quite a
Bollywood,
legend.
to see cricket, to see food. To me, that's the way. That's the fun of this job. Is not just policy, but people. Because in the end of the day, people will come and go who are politicians. But if we know each other, that will sustain for our lives.
Because that's what your job initially was, right? You're more of a people's person.
Yeah.
You that's why there was talk about you running, and you went to the primary states also.
Yeah,
At that
yeah.
time, it was like, okay, he's going to be running for president. So you're more a people's person, and diplomacy is a lot about people-to-people
Exactly.
contact, right?
Yep.
And this relationship too, India-US relationship, people-to-people driven.
And I hope that I can bring more of the Indian people to America, because I think the bridge from here to America is very strong. Indians really know Americans, and everybody has a cousin or a friend or a child in America. Not enough Americans have come to India. More Americans